Mr. President, the following messages are dated January 30, 2025. Message number 154. Mr. President, the following bills passed the House on third reading by the votes indicated. House Bill 103, Columbarium Regulation, ayes 60, excused 2. Message number 155. House Bill number 135, Autologous of Direct Blood Donations, ayes 57, noes 3, excused 2. Message number 157. House Bill number 207, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, ayes 57, noes 3, excused 2. Message number 158. House Bill number 214, Local Government Payments, Electronic Payments, ayes 60, excused 2. Message number 164. House Bill number 160, Voter Identification Revisions, ayes 53, noes 8, excused 1. Mr. President, the following bills passed the House on third reading in amended form by the votes indicated. House Bill number 148, Message number 148, House Bill number 23, Surrender Driver's License Repeal, ayes 60, excused 2. Message number 149, House Bill 27, Disabled Parking Windshield Placards Revisions, ayes 60, excused 2. Message number 150, House Bill number 42, Regulation of Surgical Abortions, ayes 52, noes 8, excused 2. Message number 151, House Bill number 43, Age Verification for Websites with Harmful Material, ayes 59, noes 1, excused 2. Message number 152, House Bill number 61, State Land Lease Preference Amendments, ayes 60, excused 2. Message number 153, House Bill number 62, Prostitution Amendments, ayes 60, excused 2. Message number 156, House Bill number 173, Independent Candidate Requirements, ayes 49, noes 11, excused 2. Message number 159, House Bill number 232, Elections Hand Counting for Recounts, ayes 51, noes 9, excused 2. Message number 160, House Bill number 36, Hathaway Scholarship Amendments, ayes 61, excused 1. Message number 161, House Bill number 63, Working Animal Protection Act, ayes 53, noes 8, excused 1. Message number 162, House Bill number 64, Chemical Abortions Ultrasound Requirement, ayes 48, noes 13, excused 1. Message number 163, House Bill number 131, Ballot Drop Boxes Prohibition, ayes 51, noes 10, excused 1. Message number 165, House Bill number 258, State-Funded Capital Construction, ayes 56, noes 5, excused 1. Message number 166, House Joint Resolution 4, Constitutional Amendment, Veterans Property Tax Exemption, ayes 58, noes 2, excused 1. Sincerely, Katie Talbot, House Chief Clerk.
Thank you, Randy. Reports from standing committees.
Mr. President, the following reports are dated January 30, 2025. Committee number 2, Appropriations, to whom was referred Senate File 68, Government-Owned Lands, respectfully report same back to the Senate with a recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Driscoll, Guru, Larson, Salazar, and Smith. Senator Salazar, Chairman. Your committee number 2, Appropriations, to whom was referred Senate File 112, Anesthesiologist Assistance Licensing, respectfully report same back to the Senate with a recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Driscoll, Guru, Larson, Salazar, and Smith. Senator Salazar, Chairman. Your committee number 2, Appropriations, to whom was referred Senate File 127, Administrative Rules, Legislative Review and Objection, respectfully report same back to the Senate with a recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Driscoll, Guru, Larson, Salazar, and Smith. Senator Salazar, Chairman. Committee number 2, Appropriations, to whom is referred Senate File 148, Fire Suppression and Restoration Funding, respectfully report same back to the Senate with a recommendation that it do pass. Ayes Senators Driscoll, Baru, Larson, Salazar, and Smith. Senator Salazar, Chairman. Your committee number 2, Appropriations, to whom is referred Senate File 152, Wildfire Management Task Force and State Forester. Respectfully report same back to the Senate with a recommendation that it do pass. Ayes Senators Driscoll, Baru, Larson, Salazar, and Smith. Senator Salazar, Chairman.
Thank you, sir. We lost our majority floor leader. Senator Dockstetter,
While we round up a majority floor leader, may I have privilege of the floor?
you bet.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today we have in the gallery above us the elected directors, employees from across the state representing Wyoming's rural electric cooperatives. And I will name them off here for you, folks. In the gallery, we have Bighorn REA, Basin, Wyoming, Bridger Valley Electric Association, Mountain View, Wyoming, Carbon Power and Light, Saratoga, Wyoming, Garland Light and Power, Powell, Wyoming, High Plains Power, Riverton, Wyoming, High West Energy, Pine Bluffs, Wyoming, Niobrara Electric Association, Lusk, Wyoming, Powder River Energy, Sundance, Wyoming, Wheatland REA, Wheatland, Wyoming, Wyrulic Company, Lingle, Wyoming, Fall River Rural Electric Cooperative, Alta, Wyoming, and I've saved the best for last, Lower Valley Energy, Star Valley, Jackson. Welcome them to the Senate.
Some of the most powerful people in Wyoming. It's not morning? All right. I was going to say the brightest, but they are pretty powerful too. All right, Madam Majority Floor Leader, that clears the desk.
Mr. President, I move that the Senate resolve itself into Committee of the Whole.
You've heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. Motion carried. Senator Cooper, come back up and take the seat.
Sure.
Yep.
Committee of the Whole will come to order. Our first bill for consideration this afternoon is Senate File 113.
Senate File 113, Brader Opportunity Act, an act relating to professions and occupations, sponsored by Senator Hutchings, was referred to Committee number 10, which turned to committee recommendation that it do pass. Ayes Senators Barlow, Crum, Hutchings, Scott, and Steinmetz. Senator Barlow, Chairman.
Committee, what is your pleasure? Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move with the Committee of the Whole rise its report and do so with a due pass recommendation on Senate File 113, Brader Opportunity Act, and I request that the good bringer of the bill, Senator Hutchings, explain the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hutchins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really simple bill. One of the most important bills you'll pass this year outside of the budget. It's simple, straightforward, no nonsense, and purely common sense. 35 states have already removed licensure requirements for braiding natural hair, and I would love Wyoming to be the 36th. We were the first, I was told, to go to the Cosmetology Board to get their help to groom this bill. This is a job creations bill. By its passage, we will have at least 4 wins for Wyoming. The braider is given a job to help support their family. Once hired and working for a licensed cosmetologist, they could possibly see what's all involved and be prompted to go to cosmetology school to get a license. It adds another taxpayer on the rolls. It opens the market for more braiders, which means we do not have to go to another state and spend our time and money there to get the job done. We can keep it all in Wyoming. Wyoming is a pro-career training and education promoter. There's no better way to do it than this. There may be some questions regarding alopecia, which we'll talk about a little later if we need to. Anything can cause tension alopecia to hair. Braiding, ponytails, tight styles. As for braiding, If someone thinks their hair is being braided too tight, they can speak out. As for a cosmetologist saying, if we had to go to school for my license, so should the braider. Well, to that I would ask, what other area in our laws require a license to teach a license for something that they do not teach? We have absolutely no opposition to this bill in committee, and I hope for the same in committee of the whole. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll go through the bill. It's an act relating to professions and occupations, the practice of braiding natural hair. And just in case you don't know what that means, you've all seen athletes with the corn rolls or braids when they're boxing, or you see people on the street with braids. And it doesn't matter which race or sex, people like to get their hair braided for protective styles, as we call it. With that, Mr. Chairman, we go on to page 2. And there's a definition of what braiding is. It talks about the many devices that a braider can use, and then it talks about the practice of braiding hair, what it means and what it doesn't mean. There's a great demand for this, Mr. Chairman, across our state. So going on to page 3, we have the exemption, which is the biggest part of this bill. This act shall not apply to a person solely engaged in the practice of braiding natural hair. The practice of natural hair braiding is not regulated under this title and is separate and distinct from barbering, the practice of hairstyling, and the practice of cosmetology. And that's pretty much it, Mr. Chairman, and we have an effective date of July 1st. Thank you. Oh, I respectfully ask for your eye.
Any other discussion? Ready for the question? All those in favor of Senator Barlow's motion, when the committee of the whole rises to report it, they do so with a favorable recommendation of Senate File 113, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? 113 is passed, committee of the whole. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 110.
Senate File 110, Inclusion of Crossing Guards for Governmental Claims Act, an act modifying the Wyoming Governmental Claims Act to include crossing guard volunteers and faculty. Sponsored by Senator Brennan. It was referred to Committee Number 8, which turned to committee recommendation that it do pass by Senators Anderson, Brennan, Cooper, Kolb, and Pappas. Senator Pappas, Chairman.
You've heard the reading. Committee, what is your pleasure? Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the committee of the whole rises to report, that it do so with a due pass recommendation on Senate File 110, Inclusion of Crossing Guards for Governmental Claims Act. And for an explanation of this bill, I would ask you to call on the sponsor, Senator Brennan.
Senator Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have another great little bill for us here today. This bill modifies the Wyoming Governmental Claims Act to include crossing guard volunteers and faculty and provides for an effective date. If you go on to page 2 of this bill, you'll see that all we're doing is including volunteers and school district employees acting as a roadway crossing guard on behalf of or in service of a public school district legally organized as a body incorporated pursuant to Wyoming Statute 21-3-101. This bill came about as there is been a student that was killed in a crossing guard in our district several years ago, and even just a few months ago, we had another child that was hit in an attempt to, I believe, go home from school. And this one particular mother has worked really hard, who lost her son, to make sure that other students can get to and from school safely, and has asked the district to have a district-sponsored crossing guard program, and they said that they couldn't do that. And in saying why they couldn't do that, one of the reasons is that they said that volunteers and staff of the school don't have immunity in this, so they could be sued. And so I, Mr. Chairman, would just ask that we would take this roadblock away from them, and that we would include volunteers and public school employees in our in our Governmental Claims Act so that our kids can get to and from school safely.
Thank you, Senator Brennan. Any other discussion on the bill? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senator Pappas's bill to motion to, when the committee of the whole rises to report, that it do so with a favorable recommendation of Senate File 110, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Senate File 110 is passed committee of the whole. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 135.
Senate File 135, Defense of State Banking 1, an act related to banks sponsored by Senator Rothfuss. It was referred to Committee Number 9, which returned a committee recommendation that it do pass amended. Ayes Senators Anderson, Cooper, Jones, Nethercott, and Rothfuss. Senator Anderson, Chairman.
Senator Anderson, what is your pleasure?
Mr. Chairman, I move that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report, they do so with the recommendation that Senate File 135 do pass. And there is a standing committee amendment. Could you have that read in at this time?
Senate File 135, Standing Committee Amendment Number 1, page 1, line 1, delete.
Thank you, and I'll turn this over to Senator Rothfuss for his explanation. Thank you.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Senate File 130, excuse me, that's not what we're on. Let's do 135 then, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Senate File 135, Defensive Banking, is a product of the blockchain through the interim, and you can see that sponsors are from the Select Committee, although it wasn't sponsored by the Select Committee because we're prohibited from sponsoring within Title 13. But the legislation comes from some concern that we have with regard to the dual banking system. Mr. Chairman, the United States, as you may know, may not know, has had for many years, since clear back in 1863, a dual banking system where our state chartered banks and our federal banks, national banks, are considered to be equivalent in terms of what they can and can't do. In recent years, through some of the work that we've seen on the Blockchain Select Committee with our new special purpose depository institutions, but also with our traditional state chartered banks, we've seen some intrusion by the federal government, some federal agencies, the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, that have restricted our ability to actually implement some of the things that we've been trying to do that are innovative within the state of Wyoming. And, there's been a lot of concerns with a program called Operation Choke Point, where the FDIC specifically restricted the access to banking for certain industries. I think many in here are familiar with that, and that certainly affected the digital asset industry. The intent of this legislation is to provide the state of Wyoming with an understanding that it has the capacity to engage on behalf of our dual banking system when there is a problem with potential federal overreach. So we see in Section 1 the overall guidance for this, that when federal financial regulators overreach or abuse their authority in the regulation of Wyoming state chartered banks, the harm extends not only to the bank, but the state of Wyoming itself. On to page 2, we enter Title 13 on the Defense of State Banking Act, providing authorization to the Attorney General to defend the state's banking interests. So the little bit of difference here, the nuance here, is that right now a state chartered bank or an individual bank would have to bring suit if they were being unfairly treated. But as it turns out, those financial institutions don't like to bring lawsuits against their regulators because those regulators are regulating them and they need cooperation. It's a bit of a chilling effect. You don't want to sue the entity that can control whether or not you can continue to operate. And so in anecdotal conversation, private conversation, we heard that there was concern with that relationship and that it would be more favorable if the state, upon seeing an abuse, were allowed to step in and that there was clarity there. So this tries to provide that clarity for the Attorney General, giving the Attorney General and the Governor's Office the opportunity to engage in potential litigation on behalf of the state rather than having to wait and team up with an individual financial institution. So you see the Romanet 1 on the bottom of page 2 provides some background of the dual banking system and how that it's in the state's interest to provide access to innovation and freedom for the state, and that we see that recent cases have shown that that's been falling through. On page 3, Romanet 2, in order for the dual banking system to succeed, state and nationally chartered banks must be fairly treated under the law without undue regard to the origin of a bank's charter, political inclinations, or any other concerns beyond the explicit scope of the law. And then we see Romanet 3, a further statement that the state of Wyoming has an interest in ensuring that its laws authorizing state chartered banks are respected and treated fairly, and that the innovative nature of those banks shall be respected. And then finally, the provision B, which is providing the authority to the Attorney General. You see that the Attorney General, as written in the original legislation, we have here, shall investigate any allegation by a Wyoming state chartered bank of unlawful disparate treatment by federal or other states' regulators. And then the Attorney General shall take any available action deemed necessary to defend Wyoming's interest in the dual banking system and its interest in assuring that similarly situated Wyoming state chartered banks are fairly treated. So that's the bill, and that brings me to the amendment. At this time, I would move Standing Committee Amendment number 1 to Senate File 135. Ask the body's favorable consideration. Mr. Chairman, the amendment comes with conversation from the Executive Office of Concern for Separation of Powers, and the desire of the bill is to make it very clear that the Attorney General has the authority. The concern from the Executive Office was that this shall language is a compulsion that violates the separation. So we worked with them, and we have some softened language that provides for that exception and changes basically the shalls to mays, as you see, and requiring changes to allowing. So there's a couple of revisions in that B paragraph that soften the language to the point where the separation of power concerns are gone and the Executive Office is comfortable with the legislation. So, Mr. Chairman, this is just trying to provide the state itself with the standing, if it chooses to engage in litigation in defense of our state banking system. It isn't a compulsion. There's no appropriation associated with it. But we had concerns with past actions that the state didn't feel like it had the standing, and it certainly didn't feel like it could just come in and support a specific business very easily. So this provides the state with that unique standing to advocate on behalf of the dual banking system. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions on the amendment, the Standing Committee Amendment number 1, and if there are none on the amendment, I'd call for the question.
Questions on the amendment? All those in favor of Senator Anderson's motion to adopt Standing Committee number 1?
Point of order, that was my motion.
I'm sorry. Senator Rothfuss's amendment to Standing Committee Amendment number 1 to Senate File 135, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Standing Committee Amendment number 1 is passed. Back to the bill.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for the support, good senator from the eastern part of the state. Mr. Chairman, with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions on the bill. I think this is important for our dual banking system.
Discussion on the bill. Senator Dockstader, are you standing?
Sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sponsor, this is very complicated. So, action to defend the state's interest in dual banking. Is the state going to take this on and start the defense in these bank examinations if they're in there? This is. I've got some reservations about this piece of legislation. Thank you.
Senator Case.
Mr. Chairman, I'm trying to understand how we can assert standing, but that doesn't necessarily give us standing in a federal proceeding. I'd like a little bit more about how that would work.
Further discussion? Senator Rothfuss?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the first question about defending bank examinations, now the bank examinations would go as normal. This is a situation where we've had conflict, as I noted, where the nationally chartered banks are honestly just treated a little bit better than the state chartered banks a lot of the time. And that is an unacceptable inequity, and it's contrary to the dual banking system. Our state chartered banks are supposed to be treated in an equal capacity. They're supposed to have access to the Federal Reserve. They're supposed to have the capacity to have banking privileges to bank, for example, those companies that deal in oil and gas, or for example, those companies that manufacture firearms, or for example, those companies that deal in digital assets. And we have seen over the last several years, debanking take place where there's basically been an isolation of certain industries and they were incapable of accessing the bank system. This tries to provide a uniform playing field and allow the state standing capacity to engage directly and say, our companies in the state of Wyoming and the interests of the people of the state of Wyoming are being violated. And again, that's not a compulsion. It's up to the executive branch through the Attorney General to make a decision about whether or not the executive branch desires to engage. And over the past few years, there have been circumstances where the executive branch has desired to engage, but it was tricky from a standing point. It was hard to get to the point where the state could directly engage, and in the end, the individual state chartered bank had to file the lawsuit against their regulator. As I said, that's a little bit awkward. So the intent of this bill is to allow the state to directly intervene, Mr. Chairman. Getting to my good friend from Lander's question, we can try and say that we have standing, but the court doesn't have to agree. That's absolutely the truth. And that's what we discussed, certainly during the interim. But in the discussion, there was general consensus during the discussion that the way we structured this provides a compelling argument that the state does have standing. Will the court accept that? It's going to be up to the court. It's always up to the court to decide who has standing. But the statutes that we have, you can see in the A paragraph particularly, are providing that the state legislature finds that the dual banking system, or the state of Wyoming, I should say, finds that the dual banking system is an interest of the state of Wyoming, and that the state should be entitled to that standing. So, strong point, that was basically the nature of the discussion we had. So, Mr. Chairman, from that vantage point, it's sort of a might help, can't hurt, and hopefully it's more than a might help, because I would hope that courts would look to this and find it compelling. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy to answer any more questions.
Any further discussion? You ready for the question? All those in favor of Senator Anderson's motion, when the committee of the whole rises to report it, do so with a favorable recommendation of Senate File 135. Please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Senate File 135 is passed committee of the whole. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 64.
Senate File 64, Wyoming opposes mandatory electronic ID devices, livestock, an act relating to agriculture, livestock, and other animals, sponsored by Senator Steinmetz. Was referred, one moment please, to committee number 5, which turned to committee recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Crago, French, Ide, McEwen, and Pearson. Senator French, chairman.
Senator French, what's your pleasure?
I move that when the committee of the whole rises to report, it do so with recommendation that Senate File 82 do pass, and for an
64.
explanation, I call on Senator Steinmetz.
64.
64.
I'm sorry? Right.
I thought I said 64. Sometimes I'm dyslexic. Senate File 64.
Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and if you like to push back against federal overreach, here's your bill. Americans have built a comprehensive and effective disease traceability system, which has proven over the decades to be reliable, affordable, flexible, and the envy of the world in its ability to protect the food supply. Just as important is the system's protection of private property rights, assuring confidentiality, proprietary investments, and cost-adjusted aspects that fit the producer. Wyoming laws have codified the right to voluntarily identify livestock using historically reliable means such as brands, back tags, tattoos, and ear tags. The new electronic identification device mandate is being implemented by the United States Department of Agriculture and went into effect in November as an agency rule. In other words, this was not requested by Congress, or more importantly, by the livestock industry. With that, fellow senators, that's the reason for the bill. If you go through the bill, you'll look at the legislative findings are contained in the first part. And this is where we're concerned. We know that our voluntary system has served our livestock industry well for decades. We know this is an agency rule. We know the vast majority of livestock affected by this rule as of right now are from wide open spaces and live on clean, disease-free pastures, not in confined areas with thousands of livestock coming from different areas. And if you go on into page 4, we're stating what the policy of the state of Wyoming is. And we're putting it into the green books that Wyoming is opposed to the Animal Plant Health Inspection Services rule mandating electronic identification devices in livestock, and that Wyoming Statute 11-18-117 clearly defines the terms by which the Wyoming livestock industry can continue to do business and have the freedom, right, and liberty to use the historically reliable, affordable, confidential, and voluntary methods of livestock identification, including brands, back tags, tattoos, and ear tags. And that does include EID ear tags if someone so chooses that. The problem we have is the mandatory nature of this rule. And so that basically, in a nutshell, is what we're doing. You can read the rest for yourself. And there is a Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1, and I would ask that that be read in at this time because it relates to the rest of the bill.
Senate File 64, Committee of the Whole Amendment Number 1, page 5, line 14, delete.
And I would move Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1 to Senate File 64, and just tell you in subsection C, that is where the amendment comes in. We're saying that the Wyoming Livestock Board shall inform livestock producers of all available options under WS 11-18-117 for the identification regarding disease traceability. We took out the veterinarians because we don't want to put them in the crosshairs of this with the federal government. And then in subsection D, the buyers of livestock in receiving states shall be responsible for tagging livestock if an electronic identification device requirement is mandated in the receiving state, unless the Wyoming livestock owner has voluntarily utilized EID devices. And basically, that is just in there. It's not meant to affect anyone's contracting abilities or anything like that, just for our producers to know that they have options and that is available to them. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would ask for the question on the amendment, or ask for any questions on the amendment. If not, call the question.
Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator Steinmetz' motion to adopt Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1 to Senate File 64, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? That amendment is passed. Senator Steinmetz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's my explanation of the bill. I'd stand for any questions.
Further discussion on the bill? Senator Case?
Mr. Chairman, I'm kind of of the belief these resolutions don't do anything. Couldn't we just write a letter?
Further discussion? Senator Steinmetz? As soon as I find you.
Mr. Chairman, we've commented, we've pushed back in every way we know, and this clearly directs our livestock board as to how we want to proceed. Thank you.
Further discussion? Seeing none? Oh, Senator Wright, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On and for this bill, I think this is a really good bill. This gives certain livestock producers an avenue to not comply with the April 2024 rule. And I think it's good to codify this in instead of just writing them a letter. So as the good bringer of the bill said, that the enforcers can have something to stand on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator French's motion that when the committee of the whole rises to report it, do so with a favorable recommendation of Senate File 64, please say aye. Those opposed? Senate File 64 is passed committee of the whole. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 88.
Senate File 88, 2025 Large Project Funding, an act relating to the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Funding Act, sponsored by the Natural Resource Funding Committee, was referred to Committee Number 6, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass amended. Ayes Senators Boner, Hicks, Jones, Landon, and Schuler. Was re-referred to Committee Number 2, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass. Ayes Senators Driscoll, Guru, Larson, Salazar, and Smith. Senator Salazar, Chairman.
Committee, what is your pleasure? Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, I would move that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report it, do so with a due pass recommendation on Senate File 88, the 2025 Large Project Funding Bill. Fellow Senators, a little refresher for those of us who have been around, some who haven't been around for that long, and maybe some brand new information for some of the newcomers to the Senate. This is in relation to the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resources Trust. We have a select committee that serves in this area of the world. We have an agency of 2 people who run this particular agency with a board that is appointed from throughout the state, and it is a working board, Mr. Chairman. One of the hardest working entities that we have in state government, quite frankly. And so when we get these projects, Senators, we know that they are well vetted. They're vetted by that board and by boots on the ground. And then we follow up with our select committee, which, Mr. Chairman, you've served on that with distinction the last 4 years, I believe. Anyway, so this large project bill is reflective of this, of the work that is being suggested for the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resources Trust for the coming year. There were 77 projects that the Wildlife Trust supported this past year. What you see budgeted in this is the large projects, which is a threshold of $500,000. We are able to begin to ratchet up the projects that we can fund throughout the state, fellow senators, because finally, a couple of years ago, you might remember that we were fortunate enough to top this resource trust fund to the target number of $200 million. The only thing that is spent on behalf of these projects comes from the dividends and interest off that fund. So I'm going to walk you real quickly through the bill. You have handouts on your desk if you want to follow along. There's visuals and great information provided by our agency folks. Or if you follow in the bill, you can certainly do it that way as well. I just want to run quickly through what the bill contains. On page 2, you see the Thunder Basin Habitat 3 project, and the appropriation appears over on page 4, $620,000. That Thunder Basin project is a game and fish project, and it's the restoration of native ecosystems through vegetation management, repair and restoration, fence modifications, and invasive species control. Really a big project up in the northeast part of the state. Baggs Valley Headwaters 3 is a project down along the Little Snake River in southern Wyoming. That is a critical deer habitat, and it's made even more critical, Senators, because of the winter 2 years ago. We are restoring shrubland down there. It's interesting, the director described for us we have a little lek to the senator from Bates Creek. We've got a little lek of Columbia sharp-tailed grouse down there, which is pretty unique, but it's obviously a beautiful area, something that if you want to know more about, you can look up the senator from Baggs, and I know he can tell you all about it. This is the fourth phase down there in work going on, and that budgetary item, $750,000. Some of these projects do carry over, and sometimes we will fund 3 and 4 legs of a particular project if it's too big. Kemmer Highway 189 migration. This is the underpasses over there near Kemmer and one overpass. And so you will see the budget amount over on the bottom of page 7. This is a big one, but it is also a project that has received amazing support from several different entities, including the federal government. $6,209,838 is what's coming out of the trust this year to support all of that effort. And by the way, the Dry Piney work is pretty well completed. The underpasses over on the western part of the state. It's absolutely working. Prior to those underpasses on that highway, we were killing a deer every day, Mr. Chairman. That's been cut down dramatically, maybe one every couple of months now. So this absolutely works. The state of Wyoming is being held up as a great example for some of this work for migration corridors and protecting our wildlife with these overpasses and underpasses. The Wind River Cheatgrass Project, that is a cooperative effort led, really want to tip our hats to the Fremont County Weed and Pest folks. They are heading this project up. It's from Bull Lake all the way to Red Canyon, for those who know that part of the world. It's a cooperation with the tribes and private and federal lands up there. We had a lot of feral horses, and those were removed, Mr. Chairman. There was some damage, and a lot of this effort is to go in and try to mitigate some of those invasive species and repair that habitat up there. That's mule deer, elk, moose, antelope, bighorn sheep. We've got just about every one of our big wildlife species are located in that part of the world. That's an $883,720 appropriation. Let's keep going quickly. I don't want to bore everybody, but Northeast Wyoming cheatgrass, that's a project that's headed up by the Sheridan County Weed and Pest, a collaborative effort by 4 different counties. And so it's the Northeast Wyoming IGWIG. And I don't remember what that moniker is all about, but it's 4 of the counties up north. The project purpose is removal of invasive grasses, about 78,000 acres in Sheridan, Johnson, Campbell, and Crook. You'll hear a lot about this, Mr. Chairman, just to take a side bar for a minute. As we enter the budget, you'll hear this come up again, this Wyoming Wildlife Natural Resources Trust. There's very likely going to be some budgetary items that are sent that direction. It's because the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resources Trust and the director over there are remarkable at accomplishing big things with this money. And so that's why you'll see some money going into that budget above and beyond what we're talking about today. And most of that is going to be for invasive species. We've got an opportunity, fellow senators, to kind of zero in on this invasive species issue. We're trying to get out ahead of it. Counties are on top of it. The northeast part of the state is particularly concerning for us, but you'll see a project coming up at the end of the bill where we're attacking invasive species over on the west too. So, Mr. Chairman, a lot on cheatgrass. That project up in Sheridan County, $4.5 million on that one. We're trying to really pour the gas to getting out ahead of some of this Medusa head, Nada, cheatgrass up in that country. The Upper Green Fence Project is the result of a lot of work up there by our Game and Fish and Sublette County Conservation District. it's based on collars and cameras and lots of observation up there, and that's some fence modifications to help in a really critical migration habitat up there, $250,000. The Wapiti Habitat Restoration is up in Park County on the North Fork. Our two senators from up there know all about that. We've been working a little bit in that country on fish migration and spawning habitat. Finally, we come to probably the most important project out of all of them, Mr. Chairman, the Natrona Core Cheatgrass Project, and that's down toward Shirley Rim. That appropriation, $884,000. I skipped over what the amount was on the Park County project, my apologies, but that one is a $550,000 project. That's a really quick rundown, Mr. Chairman, of all the work going on with your Wildlife Trust. I was privileged to be a co-chairman with one of our new senators here. Senator Crago served as the co-chairman from the other side, and I'm sure he shares the enthusiasm of the work this group has been doing and will continue, as you can see. So be glad to try to answer any questions that we can.
Senator Landon, there are some amendments to this bill. There is an amendment. Would you like that read in?
I would, Mr. Chairman, and my apologies.
Senate File 88, Standing Committee Amendment Number 1, page 15, line 16, delete.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for catching that. I would move Standing Committee Amendment Number 1 to Senate File 88 and ask for your favorable consideration. This simply deletes Game and Fish and commission and inserts the Sublette County Conservation District on that project that I just described for you. So that was a correction, and would ask for your favorable consideration.
Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senator Landon's motion to adopt Standing Committee Number 1 amendment, Standing Committee Amendment Number 1 to Senate File 88, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? That amendment has passed. Back on the bill. Any
Thank you, Mr.
discussion on the
Chairman.
bill? Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, I just want a full disclosure that my employer is one of the project recipients in this grant. I derive no pecuniary benefit whether this is funded or not, but I just wanted the people know I will be voting on this, but my employer is a recipient on that, just for disclosure purposes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hicks. Further discussion? All those in favor of Senator Landon's motion that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report it, do so with a favorable recommendation of Senate File 88, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Senate File 88 is passed Committee of the Whole. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 130.
Senate File 130, Emergency Assistance Immunity Mental Health Services, an act relating to civil procedure, sponsored by Senator Rothfuss, was referred to Committee Number 10, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Barlow, Crum, Hutchings, and Scott. Excused, Senator Steinmetz. Senator Barlow, Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Scott, what's your pleasure?
Mr. Chairman, I move in the Committee of the Whole rise and report to do so with the recommendation that Senate File 130 do pass. There were no standing committee amendments, and I yield to Senator Rothfuss for an explanation of the Senate file.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I bring Senate File 130, Emergency Assistance Immunity Mental Health Services. Mr. Chairman, this was a request by our mental health and behavioral health services community that through work on during this last interim, working with Behavioral Health Workforce Task Force, a joint effort with the executive branch. Some of the efforts that were focused on were training in mental health and first aid related to mental health, trying to ensure that there was much broader access to that type of training, and so that the general public had a better idea and better understanding of what to do in emergent situations. Well, one of the things that came up during that conversation, Mr. Chairman, was the fact that there was no clarity within our Good Samaritan laws in statute that that type of first aid, mental health first aid, was going to be covered by our existing Good Samaritan law. So the request was made to just provide that clarity in statute, and that's what the legislation simply does. You'll see, going from page 1 on to page 2, we're looking at the existing laws related to Good Samaritan, persons rendering emergency assistance being exempt from civil liability. And in the A paragraph, the existing language is any person licensed as a physician and surgeon under the laws of the state of Wyoming, or any other person who in good faith renders emergency care or assistance. It would add then to that, including assistance for a mental health crisis without compensation at the place of an emergency, accident, or mental health crisis, is not liable for any civil damages for acts or omissions in good faith. So it just makes it very clear that if somebody is demonstrating suicidal interests or having an emergent mental health crisis, that providing that first aid would be similar to the type of first aid you would provide if they were having a traditional emergent healthcare crisis. And then you see the rest of the page provides conforming language to make it clear that it applies consistent with our traditional healthcare crises. That's the legislation. Again, it's relatively simple, just trying to ensure that Good Samaritans continue to have the protection, and that all of the work and investment that the state has been doing to ensure that this type of mental health and emergent need first aid is being provided is available for use, and that people feel comfortable using it without being afraid that they would be held liable if that individual did end up, for example, committing suicide or having some tragedy. This is supported, Mr. Chairman, by our health, behavioral and mental health folks around the state, as well as our law enforcement community in the state. They see this as being supportive and protective of our community. With that, I'd ask for favorable consideration, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Was there discussion? All those in favor of Senator Scott's motion, when the committee of the whole rises to report it, do so with a favorable recommendation of Senate File 130, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Senate File 130 is passed committee of the whole. The next bill for consideration is Senate File 131.
Senate File 131, Charter School Leasing, an act relating to K-12 school facilities, sponsored by Senator Driscoll, was referred to Committee Number 4, which returned a committee recommendation that it do pass amended. Ayes Senators Brennan, Olson, Rothfuss, Schuler, and Scott. Senator Schuler, Chairman.
Senator Schuler, what is your pleasure?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report, do so with the recommendation that Senate File 131 do pass. There is a standing committee amendment, if we could have that read in.
Senate File 131, Standing Committee Amendment Number 1, page 1, line 1 after.
Okay, and I would turn the time over to the good senator from Crook County to tell you a little bit about this bill and the committee and the amendment.
Senator Driscoll.
Madam Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I bring to you Senate File 131, Charter School Leasing. I would move Standing Committee Amendment Number 1 to Senate File 131, and I'll take off with it and explain it first. The amendment deals with page 1. The first, we had a drafting error, and we did relating to twice, so it strikes the relating to. The second part of it was caught by the good senator from down here. We had a little bit of difficulty in the way the title ran on it. So on line 2, it scratches that and inserts 4, and after schools inserts 2. So how it will read is an act relating to K-12 school facilities, repealing the requirement for charter schools to receive reimbursement for leasing expenses if the state construction department determines there are no existing adequate educational facilities in the school district, making conforming amendments providing for an effective date. That almost does the bill. It's kind of interesting. What we have is, as charter schools have evolved and come around, we had a section in the law, and you'll see it on page 2 on line 3, or on line 4, we strike out a section of law. And what this section of the law is where local school districts kind of sit on the charter schools, and they have to fall within that. We've struck that section of the law because here's how charter schools work. When a charter comes in, the state construction department determines if there's adequate and available space in the district. That's the requirements in that section of the law, and that's a great thing. They go out and see if there's something there before we start building something or doing anything. The hole in the law is this. So if they determine there's available and adequate within a district, the charter school is ineligible for a lease payment if Saturday is not offered. So if you have a local district that has a abandoned school building or one that's on the list, several things happen. One, it might only be available for 1 year. It might not be available at all. They may not want to do it, yet it shows as available, and it makes the charters ineligible to be able to go get something else. We also could have a situation where 2 or more charters wanted to go after school and it would conflict. So what this really does is takes ambiguity out of the law. It also leaves our local control in our districts. If they choose not to participate in the charter thing, it makes it where they don't just end up in a total battle. So this really just clarifies the law, makes it better for the charters, makes it fairer for the local school districts, make people understand it, and gets us on down the road. I'd ask for your favorable consideration and stand for any questions.
Senator Driscoll, I believe we got to dispose of this amendment first.
Thank you.
Any discussion on the amendment? Question on the amendment. All those in favor of Senator Driscoll's Standing Committee Amendment number 1 to Senate File 131, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The amendment is passed. Discussion on the bill. Senator.
Question.
Lannon.
Mr. Chairman, I just rise in support of the bill. I appreciate the senator bringing this. This is actually kind of a loophole in that section of our statutes that has allowed for our charter schools to get hung up in the process. So the other reason that I stood, senators, is just to kind of put it on the whiteboard. We've got a lot of work to do on this whole area. From a school facility standpoint, as we stand these charter schools up, we're not there yet. We probably are gonna have to get out our checkbooks. Fair enough. Those of us who have always supported school of choice, et cetera, we need to probably put our money where our mouth is. For example, Mr. Chairman, it may not mean something like a brand new building, but you might identify an old building, an older school that has been set aside by a district and just say, well, you know, we can put the charter school in there. Well, there's a reason why that school has been mothballed in the first place. And that's because it probably isn't suitable. It isn't up to standard with respect to everything from electrical to common space to windows or whatever. So then we've got to stand that up. And that could be a budget line item. Sometimes an old building, you go in there and renovate them and you're gonna have to pay for that. So just something for us to be thinking about. I sincerely believe that we're gonna have to put some elbow grease into this whole area of charter school, private school. If we continue to mix on the school facilities front, we're gonna have to address it. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senator Schuler's motion that when the committee of the whole rises to report it, do so with a favorable recommendation of Senate File 131, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Senate File 131 is passed committee of the whole. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 146.
Senate File 146, Consumer Rental Purchase Agreement Act Amendments, an act relating to trade and commerce, sponsored by Senator Boner, was referred to Committee Number 7, which returned a committee recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Boner, Case, Dockstader, Landon, and Steinmetz. Senator Case, Chairman.
Senator Case, what is your pleasure?
Mr. Chairman, I move that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report, that it do so with a due pass recommendation on Senate File 146, Consumer Rental Purchase Agreement Act Amendments. For an explanation of the fine bill, I'd ask that you call on Senator Boner.
Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is Senate File 146. This deals with stores and a business model that you may be familiar with, where customers can go in and rent to own different types of mostly furniture. So think, couches, sofas, things like washing machines, refrigerators. There's all these rent to own centers throughout the state. And it is a area where there is quite a bit of consumer protection that is in our statutes. And so, as you can imagine, this is usually a population that can't necessarily afford to go out and buy these sorts of equipment and necessities for modern life. And so we have all these consumer protections in the Rental Purchase Agreement Act. And so this bill doesn't necessarily address that part of it, whether that's a good idea or not, but it does update it. The last time this act was updated was 1996. There's been quite a few changes since then, Mr. Chairman. Most notably, there's been this move to online rentals, online sales. And so the bill in its most basic form updates our statutes to ensure that we're relevant and making sure that we're not inhibiting some of the newer business practices. So specifically, the Senate file clarifies how the rental purchase transaction rules apply to the online world, where you can, you don't have to go to a physical store necessarily to accomplish a rent-to-own agreement. There's online shopping as well, and it also modernizes transaction disclosure rules to this digital world. So 3 substantive changes right now in the bill. First, it clarifies that whether a rental purchase transaction is in person or online, the merchant must have a license to operate in Wyoming. So we got the brick and mortar stores taken care of. We want to make sure it's very clear that you can sell online, but you have to have a license, just like the brick and mortar stores. So there's some parity there. The current statute is unclear whether an online-only business needs to have a license. So it clarifies that, yes, you do in fact have to have a license. Second, it makes it clear that all notices and disclosures can be provided digitally. So these are the little tags you might think of that disclose the rate that one would pay for these rental purchase agreements. It has similar provisions to apply that to an online store, making sure that that consumer protection element extends to the online world as we currently require in brick and mortar institutions. Finally, it simplifies the licensing of rental purchase merchants to provide rental purchase services through third-party retailers like local furniture stores. So this is sort of like a hybrid situation where maybe you have a furniture store that deals with this on regular furniture sales, but they also want the added option of having this rent-to-own product for their customers. And the way that they can do that is by partnering with a online retailer. So it provides that flexibility for our businesses if they so choose to sort of have this hybrid model. And in that case, it only requires one license for the service provider throughout the state, rather than a separate license being required for each location. And the fee is about twice as much in that circumstance. So the existing act in its current form requires that pricing information, including the weekly or monthly payment amount and the number of payments, will be displayed on each item. So once again, this makes sure that we're covered in the online world, and just making sure that we update this basic little piece of consumer protection that has not been updated almost 30 years to make sure that we're still performing the function of this legislation, that we have an even playing field between brick and mortar institutions as well as online institutions. And that's basically the bill, Mr. Chairman. I have a very detailed explanation if we'd like to go line by line, but I'll forego that and maybe stand for any questions if anybody has them.
Senator Case, I believe there was a committee of the whole amendment. Is that still on the table?
Yes, I'd like that read, please.
Senate File 146, Committee of the Whole Amendment Number 1, page 1, line 11, delete.
Sir, I got one of those.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1 to Senate File 146 and ask for your favorable consideration. This is a big 6-page heavy lift, changing this bill all around, but all it does is really change one word. I like statutes that are clear. When this is a consumer protection statute, so when a consumer reads this way they'll now know that the administrator that we're referring to is actually the banking commissioner. We discussed this change with the banking commissioner and on all of the committees, so it's not a surprise to anybody. Just the word administrator appears so many different times, but it would be difficult, I think, for a consumer to try to figure out what their rights are to know that the administrator is the Wyoming Banking Commissioner. And so that's all this amendment does. I'd ask for your favorable consideration.
Further discussion on the amendment, Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This seems like a good improvement on the current act. We heard in committee that actually the commission had never heard a complaint. I think that might be part of the problem is that, you know, if somebody reaches action, it's not very clear who they would submit a complaint to. So the Banking Commission is responsible for administering this regulation. And so I do think that this is a good addition, well within the intent of the bill, so.
Further questions on the amendment? Question. All those in favor of Senator Case's motion to adopt Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1 to Senate File 146, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? That amendment has passed. Back on the bill. Any questions on the bill or discussion? Question on the bill. All those in favor of Senator Case's motion that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report, that it do so with a favorable recommendation of Senate File 146, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Senate File 146 is passed to Committee of the Whole. Madam Majority Floor Leader.
I request that the Committee of the Whole stand at ease to the sound of the gavel for about 15 minutes.
You've heard the motion. All those in favor? Aye. Committee of the Whole stands at ease. Next bill for our consideration is Senate File 112.
Senate File 112, Anesthesiologist Assistance Licensing, an act relating to professions and occupations, sponsored by Senator Schuler, was referred to Committee Number 10, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass amended. Ayes, Senators Crum, Hutchings, Scott. Noes, Senators Barlow and Steinmetz. Senator Barlow, Chairman. Was re-referred to Committee Number 2, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Driscoll, Guru, Larson, Salazar, and Smith. Senator Salazar, Chairman.
Senator Boner, Senator Barlow, what is your pleasure?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report, it do so with a due pass recommendation on Senate File 112, and I further move the Standing Committee amendment. Oh, could we have the Standing Committee read in, please?
Senate File 112, Standing Committee Amendment Number 1, page 18, line 18, delete.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd further move the Standing Committee amendment, and I'll turn over the explanation of the bill to the good Senator Schuler, and then we'll deal with the Standing Committee amendment at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Schuler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm out of breath. I didn't see this one moving up the ranks here, so, but I'm ready. I'll get after it here. Let's talk about the bill first. The certified nurse anesthetists have come to us in the past looking for some help in terms of being able to expand their scope to our state. And honestly, I realize that there have been some problems in the past, and I think we've got it down this year to the point where it's going to be hopefully acceptable. But let me just tell you a little bit about the CAAs. The certified nurse anesthetists, they have a pre-med background, a bachelor's and master's degree. They complete clinical training in anesthesia. They pass a national board exam to become certified. They have to work under the direction of an anesthesiologist. They operate anesthesia equipment. They monitor patients before, during, and after anesthesia. And they basically work with the ACT model. And that is basically a model that is used around the country. They require, again, a 2 years master's level, and I don't know if I mentioned that generally takes about 24 to 28 months. Their programs are all accredited by the Council on Accreditation of Allied Health Education Programs, and their clinical training is over 2,000 hours. They typically administer about 600 different anesthetics during a variety of surgeries. They must pass a certification exam by the NCCAA. Honestly, they're practicing right now in 22 states. And again, we did hear from some of our CRNAs. They're a little bit different in scope than our CAAs, but they're both non-physician members of the ACT, and they both share identical patient care responsibilities. There's 15 programs in our country right now that are accredited to train these folks, and they have to be associated with an anesthesiology department of a medical school, and they have to have a board-certified physician anesthesiologist as the medical director. So once these folks are fully trained, your CAAs work exclusively under the medical direction of the physician anesthesiologist, and they incorporate all the principles of the anesthesia care, and they're very, like I said before, an integral member of the physician-led ACT team. So again, during testimony, if you want to take a look at the bill, we are amending a little bit of the bill, but the important thing I think that we found out was that they've done a lot of studies, and once these folks are trained, and their training is very similar to the CRNAs that do quite a bit of the work in our state, but I think this is maybe the most important part of the bill, and even the language is that regardless of the anesthesia care team, whether it's made up of a physician, an anesthesiologist, or an AA, or a CRNA, none of those are associated with any significant differences in mortality, length of stay, or inpatient spending. And I think that's probably the most important thing that we want to hear is that, we know that safety is important, and these folks are safe, they're doing a great job, And also, in terms of their training, the committee that did the study in 2023 found out that there was no evidence that any of the differences between the CRNAs and the AAs result in any disparity in knowledge base, technical skills, or quality of care when supervised by a physician anesthesiologist. All right, just taking a look at the bill. And give me just 1 second, because I don't have my, I am so sorry, do not have my amendment close by. I really got caught off guard. Oh, thank you, Senator Scott, the good senator has it. Before I actually talk about the amendment itself, the bill basically just, if you take a look at it, it just provides for the licensing of our anesthesiology assistants, and it specifies their scope of practice. And during our testimony, there were some questions about maybe the bill was a little bit too strict in terms of what it required in terms of the scope of practice. So that's really what the amendment is all about, if you want to take a look at that. And let's go ahead and do the standing committee. Oh, well, would you like to do that?
It's already moved.
Senator Barlow?
Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Chairman, I think it'd be just appropriate to take care of the standing committee amendment. This is a catch that was made by that licensing board that will be responsible for this, page 18 of the bill. It was not inclusive of the entire statute that needed to be inclusive. So you'll just see that we're removing we're expanding the parts of the current statute that would be applicable under this. So this was a catch by our licensing board, and I'd ask for your favorable consideration. Thank you.
Discussion on the amendment? All those in favor of Senator Barlow's motion to adopt standing committee amendment number 1, standing committee amendment number 1 to Senate File 112, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? That motion has passed. Back on the bill. Further discussion. Senator Schuler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's go ahead and read in the committee of the whole amendment.
Senate File 112, Committee of the Whole Amendment Number 1, corrected copy, page 1, line 7, after.
Again, this, let's just talk a little bit about the amendment here, the committee of the whole amendment. We just made a few changes with wording reinstatement on page 1, line 7, insert reactivation. There's a few others that they're important. I think the one on on line 12, page 15, line 18, we had some discussion on during the shift, we added the word concurrently, and that just talked a little bit about how the physician anesthesiologist, how many folks they can supervise during the shift, and we just changed that to concurrently. Page 16, we deleted duplicates, inserted reactivation. We did that on a few different places. Page 17.
Senator Schuler?
Yes.
I'm not sure that amendment got moved.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move Committee of the Whole Amendment Number 1 to Senate File 112 and ask for your consideration. Thank you. Page 17, line 13 through 20, this kind of got into the scope of what they can and can't do. It was pretty prescriptive, so we're going to delete that. After page 24, after license insert, deny the request, striking 5, insert 6 on page 25. The next one I think that's important is page 26, this is a long bill, sorry. After medicine, insert not less than one of whom shall be an anesthesiologist, the state board shall also consist of. This will require a change in our board, a medical board, because they are under the medical board versus the nurses being under the nursing board. And there's another section there, after members at the very bottom, strike and insert all members shall be. So there's a few changes there. Again, it's mostly scope issues and just, pretty important, obviously. But the biggest thing is we heard from at least probably 6, I think, different AAs that are working outside our state, all young people in their 30s-ish, who all want to come back to Wyoming. They're working in other states. We heard from folks that some of them have been working for 5 years, up to 15 years in other states, and they love Wyoming. They want to be back in Wyoming. And the bottom line is, this is a bill I think that we need to take a look at, because we want them back. We want our young people back. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about or take the vote on the amendment.
Further discussion on the amendment, Senator Rothfuss?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, when I'm looking at page 17, lines 13 through 20, it seems to be about what happens if an anesthesiologist assistant loses or has stolen or destroyed their license, and it provides the ability to get a duplicate license that says duplicate, et cetera. So I don't understand why that's being deleted, honestly. It seems to be a necessary part of the bill to handle a circumstance where there is a stolen, lost, or destroyed license. So I'm curious a little bit about that aspect of the Committee of the Whole Amendment. I see that that ties into a few other places above, but the heart of it is that deletion, page 17, lines 13 through 20. So why is that necessary to delete as part of this law?
Further questions? Senator Schuler?
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Senator Bartle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the question. So many of these technical corrections were also suggested by the board that would oversee these licensees. So I will have to get back to the good bringer of the question on that particular notion. Because what I believe happens is, because they have other parts of their statute that deals with this particular licensure issues and duplicate license and reactivations, and I think that's what they're relying on, is existing statute that's elsewhere in their board authority, if you will. But I will verify that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further discussion on the amendment? Okay, calling for question on the amendment. All those in favor of Senator Schuler's motion to adopt Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1 to Senate File 112, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? That amendment is passed. We're back on the bill. There's a discussion? Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, there was another Committee of the Whole amendment that was prepared, but we got surprised that the bill came up this afternoon, and it hasn't been distributed, so we'll do it on second reading. But let me tell the Senate that what it does is will allow the nurse anesthetists that are present in the state and practicing to also supervise a limited number of these anesthesiologist assistants. And that has wide support amongst the various interested parties. Will make more of these people available to the state, and will remove, I think, the remaining element of controversy that originally had been with this bill. So just warn you, that we'll bring that on second rather than fuss about it now.
Senator Schuler?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to kind of finish up, the bottom line is there are only about 9 or 10 hospitals right now in Wyoming out of the 30 that have physician anesthesiologists. And so this would just be an option for them. You know, they would be able to hire a couple of these folks to help out with the shortage. There is a shortage of anesthesiologists in our state. And so, again, this is just something a lot of other states are doing. It helps with the shortages, and like I said, these folks have got the training that they need to be a part of that team. And the anesthesiologist, it's an option. So hospitals, we had a question, you know, does every hospital have to do this if they have a full board, physician, anesthesiologist? And no, this is just an option, another tool in the toolbox for our state to be able to offer a chance, again, for folks to come back here to practice anesthesiology in our state, and to maybe help out a little bit with shortages. And so with that, again, I'm happy to answer any other questions. I think we had some really good, probably some of the best discussion we've had with our CRNAs, and they're willing to work with us. And as the good senator mentioned from Natrona, we probably have another amendment coming in that I think will show that everybody's on board with trying to do whatever we can to make our healthcare the best in the state.
Any further discussion on the bill? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senator Barlow's motion that when the committee of the whole rises to report, it does so with a favorable recommendation of Senate File 112, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Senate File 112 is passed committee of the whole. The next bill for our consideration, Senate File 119.
Senate File 119, expedited professional licensure for military members, an act relating to professions and occupations, sponsored by Senator Boner. It was referred to committee number 8, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass amended. Ayes, Senators Anderson, Brennan, Cooper, Kolb, and Pappas. Senator Pappas, chairman.
Senator Pappas, what is your pleasure?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the committee of the whole rises to report, that it do so with a due pass recommendation on Senate File 119, expedited professional licensure for military members. There is a standing committee amendment. Could I have that read in, please?
Senate File 119, standing committee amendment number 1, page 5, line 18, delete.
Thank you, and I yield the floor to Senator Boner.
Senator Boner.
Hello again, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Senate File 119 that, as the title insinuates, deals with expedited professional licensure for military members and their spouses. So, Mr. Chairman, the challenge that we've been faced with is that military families give up a lot to serve alongside the active duty member in many cases, and that often comes at the cost of their career. And certainly there's a lot of additional challenges associated with moving from place to place every 2 to 3 years. One element that this legislature and many others have looked into to help ease that burden is to make sure that when a military family does move into Wyoming, in this case, that there's not any undue delay in getting that spouse to work if that spouse does have an occupation that requires a licensure. And so we've passed similar legislation that requires an expedited process for military spouses as well as military members. And this bill just takes it a little bit further, provides a more specific direction to our boards, all of our licensing boards, as well as it reflects some changes in federal law that just occurred a few months ago. They actually put a very strict timeline, a 30-day timeline, on at least allowing for a temporary license, if you will, if that military spouse or that military member is appropriately licensed in another jurisdiction. So the bill does basically that. It applies not just to military spouses, but also to military members, and military members who have recently separated within 2 years of separating from military service and honorably discharged. They can make sure that the experience that they've gained either in the private sector or in the military is recognized by our local licensing board, and that they aren't faced with any unnecessary delays in getting to work. We hear about all the challenges we have with workforce in the state, and this is one way we can help with that. The testimony that we heard, Mr. Chairman, was that sometimes it takes up to 6 months. In spite of there's supposed to be an expedited process for licensing, but some folks are waiting for 6 months to even get that license. So I think that everybody would benefit from the legislature being a little bit more clear in our communication as to what our expectation is. And like I said, at the end of the day, this is now a federal law. I think it behooves us to make sure that we give additional direction to our licensing boards to ensure that they are in compliance with that federal law. So that's what the bill does, Mr. Chairman. I certainly stand for any questions. I don't think there's anything really necessarily all that unusual about what we're doing. Like I said, this is existing statute. We're simply consolidating the statute that used to be separate for military members and military spouses. We're also making sure that applies to recently separated veterans who have been released from military service within 2 years. So that's the bill. That's what it does. I think it's really important, especially for this community here that we're in now that has an active duty military presence, to make sure that the experiences of our military members and their spouses are treated with a proper amount of respect, and make sure they don't have to deal with undue bureaucratic delays.
Senator Pappas, over the standing committee amendment that's been read in, would anybody like to move that?
Okay.
Senator Boner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move standing committee amendment number 1, the Senate File 119, and ask for advice favorable consideration. Ladies and gentlemen, this simply corrects a typo. There's a reference on page 5, line 18 to a 33-26. There's no 33-26, there's a 33-36, and so technical correction there. I ask for favorable consideration.
Question on the amendment. Any further discussion on the amendment? Question on the amendment. All those in favor of Senator Boner's motion to adopt standing committee amendment number 1 to Senate File 119, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? That amendment is passed. There is another committee of the whole amendment floating around out there. Anybody interested in bringing that?
Senate File 119, Committee of the Whole Amendment Number 1, page 3, line 13, after.
Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move committee of the whole amendment number 1, Senate File 119. Ladies and gentlemen, this was a good addition from our military department and committee this morning, simply adding, this is on page 3 to line 13, when you're talking about saying providing copy of military orders in the circumstance where somebody is still on active duty and they're in the process of moving to Wyoming. This adds or evidence of honorable service for the additional circumstance I mentioned where somebody separates from active duty. So this covers both circumstances. I'll stand for any questions on that amendment.
Senator Boner, I missed it. Did you move that bill? I mean, that amendment?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Questions on the amendment? Seeing none? Oh, there's one. Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to be clear. We've went from service members on orders to now members after they've separated from the service. I just want to be clear. This seems like a significant expansion. Is that same expansion reflected elsewhere in the bill? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, that is a change within the bill. You're probably looking at page 2, line 13 for that policy decision. This simply conforms the rest of the bill to that decision. So if we add this to the bill, it'd be on page 3, line 13. Also, page 2 looks like lines 12, 13, 14, 15.
Further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator Boner's motion to adopt Committee of the Whole Amendment number 1 to Senate File 119, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? That amendment is passed. We're back on the bill. Further discussion, Senator Rothfuss.
Mr. Chairman, to the last point the good senator from up in the northern part of the state was talking about, I'm interested in a little more discussion about the idea of providing, preference in licensure for those that have been released from military service within the past 2 years. It seems like it's a challenging burden to expedite filings to begin with, but the case is clearly understandable where you have a service member or the service member's spouse and they move around a lot. And so that transiency makes it a bit of a challenge where you're uprooted. And at that point, if you have, pursuant to the way the language works, you've got an existing license in another state, this is typically for the spouse, and you move to a new state, and the statute, as it currently stands, says, all right, well, let's expedite that. Let's make sure that they get that equivalent license registered in the state of Wyoming quickly. So that made sense when we were passing this legislation and working on it a few years ago. But now we're in a situation that I don't quite understand, where we have a former service member that up to 2 years after they separate is given licensure preference. And I don't understand the motivation for that. And the other thing that I don't necessarily understand, because it's kind of hard to follow, is if this still would give the spouse, because we're defining this as a military service member, and we're including in the definition of military service member somebody that's separated within the last 2 years, and this includes the spouse of a military service member, which I believe then also would mean that the spouse of somebody that separated 2 years ago would still also have licensure preference under the way this is drafted now. Although, Mr. Chairman, I can't guarantee that that's true, because it's kind of hard to follow. So the question is, would that be the case, that spouse would get a couple of years of extra licensure priority? And then the next question kind of gets into this licensure priority. And again, I understand the desire when you have the transiency, which takes place an awful lot for our military personnel. They're moving around a lot, and so you need to make sure that to have meaningful access to the job market, particularly for that spouse, you need to get the licensure quickly. What are the implications of speeding up a licensure? We say that it's just bureaucracy. Is it always just bureaucracy, or is it sometimes a required licensing period based on a need for certain types of background checks or other information or whatever goes with that particular occupation? It might require testing or whatever else. So the idea of expediting it might in some instances be challenging. And then the final question is, if this is something that can be done within 30 days, honestly, why wouldn't we just kind of want it to have a generalized anti-bureaucracy restriction, which is, all licensing boards shall take action within 30 days, instead of having it just specific to military personnel getting that preference. So I have a few questions. I'm a little concerned, particularly with the extensive broadening where it starts to cover former service members as part of the definition of military service member. So a little more discussion on that, thank you.
Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll take the first one first. And so the idea is that the circumstance we're trying to cover here is, say you have somebody who is getting out of the military and then moving back to Wyoming. So maybe that 2-year time frame is a little long, but that's the circumstance that we're trying to get at with this bill, is that, if you're moving here on active orders, that'd be covered. But if you're moving here because you just got out of the active duty military, then, why would we be treating those circumstances any differently? So 2 years, maybe that's not the right amount, but that's a justification for having a recently separated military service member, and it is just the service member, not the spouse. So if you look on page 2, line 6, applicant is, I think, the applicable word. Then you can go on to further define military service member, which does not include the military spouse. As far as why we don't do this for everybody, I think that was covered. That we have a need. These people are serving our country. They're moving from place to place. And that'd be great if we could expedite all the licenses for everybody. I think that'd be a worthwhile effort, but it's a little bit outside the scope of this bill. As far as the challenge of the 30-day window and making sure everything's taken care of, we're not skipping over things and basically causing risk to the general public. I would argue that, it's important to point out that there's an opportunity for a temporary permit that allows them to do the work while they go through and verify all the additional steps that we have in Wyoming. But I have to reemphasize, Mr. Chairman, that in order to qualify for this program to begin with, you have to be licensed in another state. And so there is some level of checks and verification. Maybe it's not the exact same things that we do here in Wyoming, but that's why we have that sort of two-tiered process, or allow for that, depending on the board, where they can get that temporary permit, begin to work, while the licensing board does its due diligence and makes a final determination later. So hopefully that And hopefully that's a good way of dealing with the concerns about getting this work done in a timely manner without unduly influencing or slowing down all the other applicants. So I hope that covers the three questions from my colleague from Albany County. I'll certainly stand for more if necessary.
Further questions on the bill? Since you're ready for a question on the bill, all those in favor of Senator Pappas' motion that when the committee of the whole rises to report it, do so with a favorable recommendation of Senate File 119, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Senate File 119 is passed committee of the whole. Next bill for your consideration, Senate File 107.
Senate File 107, Freedom to Work and Build Business Act relating to miscellaneous contracts and actions, sponsored by Senator Nethercott, was referred to committee number 1, which turned to committee recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Crago, Hicks, Kolb, and Olson. Excused, Senator Crum. Senator Olson, Chairman.
Senator Olson, what is your pleasure?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My pleasure would be to make a motion that when the committee of the whole rises to report that, do so with recommendation that Senate File 107 do pass, and there are no standing committee amendments, and I'll turn over the explanation of the bill to the good majority floor leader.
Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good senators, Senate File 107, Freedom to Work and Build Business. Good senators, 1 in 5 Americans are subject to a non-compete agreement. Non-compete agreements are those agreements where an employer requires an employee to sign a contract that prohibits them from getting alternate employment that would compete against their employer's business. This practice has, in my view, become wildly out of control in this state and is really harming Wyoming employees and businesses. It inhibits competitive conditions and is really interfering with people's upward mobility and economic opportunities. And so, good senators, the onus of the bill is really found on the bottom of page 1, lines 14 through 15, and then into 2, lines 1 and 2. And the bill states as follows: any covenant not to compete that restricts the right of any person to receive compensation for performance of skilled or unskilled labor shall be void. That would be the prohibition that would be enacted into law. The bill has exceptions to this prohibition. That includes, so the prohibition would not apply to provisions associated with the selling of a business or the selling of business assets. For the protection of trade secrets, those would still be protected. Contractual provisions providing for the recovery of expenses for training an employee. So if you hire an employee and send them to a training program and you invest resources in them or give them a sign-on bonus, and the contract allows for recovery of those expenses, those would still be recoverable. And it does not apply to executive and management personnel as found on page 2, line 17. The reason for that is those CEOs and high-level positions, they're in a different bargaining position for their employment than your traditional employee. The bill goes on to discuss the application of the prohibition to physicians and other medical providers, specifically prohibiting physicians from entering into these agreements, even when it includes their partnership agreements. Oftentimes we've seen it is the practice of physicians to enter into these partnership agreements where they go into a collective type of business together. This would prevent them from prohibiting a physician who left that partnership from stopping continuing to be a physician in that community. So that's the bill. The purpose for the bill really is, I think, critical to understand that in the last really 5 years, there's been significant litigation on this topic in Wyoming, dealing with a variety of occupations, really primarily associated with those in home health care, nursing services, or home health care aides. But it affects all swaths of employment, from mechanics. There's been cases involving mechanics that are prohibited, that those cases have gone to the Wyoming Supreme Court. There are cases involving a cardiologist that have gone to the Wyoming Supreme Court, a salesman who was prohibited for being a salesman for another company. And so you can't leave your employer when offered a higher position at a competing employer, you're prohibited from doing that. It really interferes with someone's ability to get another job. The first time I saw this in my practice was years ago, but it was a school lunch lady. And she lived in southeast Wyoming, and she worked for one school district for essentially minimum wage, slightly above. And she wanted to apply for a different opportunity as a school lunch lady in another district for $1.50 more. And her non-compete said she can't do that for a period of 2 years. She cannot work at another school district as a school lunch lady making $14 an hour. And so that really interfered with her ability to provide for her family, to seek additional opportunities, and that it just didn't make a whole lot of sense for the protection of that business. The most recent case that went to the Wyoming Supreme Court dealt with the home health care aide, and again, that's not a CNA, that's not a nurse, it's below an aide, where the large corporation sued that aide and took that case all the way to the Supreme Court. And what that aide had done was she was under a non-compete, and she provided services to a family where she became a favorite provider to a disabled child. And the family wanted to retain her services full-time in order to avoid the rotating array of providers coming into the home, and just allow her to be the primary caregiver to this child. She could not do that. And so so what that also means is the inability of patients to choose their providers, from home health care aides to nurses to doctors. And you're prohibited from following your provider in the continuity of care. So again, in the last 4 to 5 years, the Wyoming Supreme Court dealt with 3 cases that are big cases, 1 dealing with a cardiologist and 2 dealing with healthcare nurses. And it's just unacceptable. And I don't think it's good policy for the state of Wyoming. And I think it's time that we join most other states and say this type of practice is not in the best interest of a competitive condition, nor is it in a patient's best interest, particularly when we have a challenge to access to healthcare. So, good senators, I'd ask for your favorable consideration on Senate File 107.
Senator Larson.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad this is coming forward. It's needed. I just have some questions, I guess. If a hospital brings in a doctor and it costs some money or whatever, how is that going to be dealt with when, I guess, if it cost him money and he was there past 2 years, does he have to pay him back if he wants to be a doctor in the town that he's at? Because that's happened quite a bit in my town. Is hospital prevents the physician of staying, if he wanted to try something different as a private doctor so anyway, thanks.
Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess I want to be clear, Section 1 of this, or Romanet A, small a, talks about skilled and unskilled labor. And then B and C go very specifically into physicians, not broad healthcare, but physicians particularly. So I guess I want to be clear, do we need B and C if physicians are actually skilled labor and all these things are void with those few exceptions? Because even in the veterinary profession, you could sign a contract, I never would, but you could sign a contract that would have a non-compete in it. It's actually quite common. But I just want to be clear, other folks, like I said, those 2 subparagraphs, if you will, they talk very specifically about physicians and an exception to the physician thing, allowing access to patients, quite honestly. But 1 is skilled and unskilled. Does skilled and unskilled actually cover everybody? And the rest is, I don't know what it's for, except to pull out physicians because they're somehow unique in some way. So that would be helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions? Senator Nethercott.
Chairman, great questions. So going to the senator directly in front of me, page 2, lines 12 through 15 address the ability of the employer to recover the sign-on bonus or the expense of educating the employee. It does have in there on line 14 through 15, it limits it to a period of 2 years. And so that's a policy decision for the body if you wanted to change that time period, that's acceptable as a policy decision. Usually, when a new employee comes and they have that sign-on period, they usually make a decision to leave sometime soon thereafter, but it does allow for that recovery. So if there's an amendment to change that period of time, I think that would be welcome for discussion, but there is that ability to recover expenses. To the good senator, who is the veterinarian, the veterinarians are a profession that love non-competes. The seminal case in Wyoming on non-compete provisions deals with veterinarians, and they are very litigious on this subject, having done a number of cases involving veterinarians. So, which is actually a real hardship, because typically the non-compete says something to this effect. You can't work as a competitor against me for a period of 2 years in a geographical area of an aerial radius of not more than 50 miles. That requires that person to leave the community, because the 50-mile aerial radius typically is the whole community. So the person has to leave, which could result in the loss of, large animal doctors in those communities. But it's a really big area for veterinarians. But to the point of why is there this separation in section, on page 2, line 21, B and C? And really, one of the primary issues here that we see is physicians leaving the state as a result of these. And there's some dispute about how often that's happening. I would assert to you that that is happening. And it's not necessarily as a result of this employer-employee relationship. It's a result of the business agreements that the doctors enter into with each other when they form a business. And so it's not your standard employee-employer relationship. But we're saying, and it's a pretty bold thing to do from the freedom to contract, which is to say, doctors, you can enter into any kind of business agreement you want, and you can recover as much money as you want from your medical partner, your doctor partner, in the event they leave the partnership. But you cannot prohibit them from practicing medicine in the community. This is a critical need for our communities, and so if you want to have an assessment within your operating agreement of $1 million for leaving the partnership, go right ahead. But you cannot prohibit them from being a doctor in the community. So it's a little bit different there, and it's fairly subtle, but it is a common practice that we see with those doctors. Paragraph C really has to do with solicitation agreements, and solicitation agreements are oftentimes confused with non-competes, but it is lawful, and this bill is not prohibiting non-solicitation agreements. So oftentimes an employer will require an employee to sign a non-solicitation agreement, which says if you leave my employment, you can't solicit our customers or our patients. So that would still be lawful, except as applied to physicians who are treating patients with rare diseases. And it allows for those physicians who are treating rare diseases to provide their contact information, essentially soliciting or arguably soliciting those patients with the rare disease so that that continuity of care can continue. So it's a real carve out to a non-solicitation provision, really allowing that patient with that rare disease who doesn't have access to a lot of providers, particularly in Wyoming, to continue and to know where that doctor may have gone in the event they leave that partnership. I think it's also really important to recognize that you can subject an employee to one of these and then fire them the next day through no fault of their own. And then they can't work in the business that they have been working in the service that they have been providing. So that can really leave them in a bind where they are unable to get other employment in the type of skill that they have learned, whether it's quote skilled or unskilled, because they were fired by an employer that they had no control over. So that's, I don't believe, consistent with free market principles. I don't think it's good for competitive conditions. I don't think it's good for a fair economy. I don't think it encourages entrepreneurialism. And I think it's contrary to the freedom to work and build business. So I seek your aye vote.
Further questions? Senator Ide.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the intent of this bill, but I'm still struggling with it here. You know, a lot of private contracts appear to be pretty draconian, and a lot of them are, but at the end of the day, they are still voluntary. So I think businesses should be free to set the conditions of, what they want when they hire people. So just, that's just a comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further comments on the bill? Senator Pipman, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll just provide some of my experience with some of these. In the oil and gas industry, especially being a landman, what you see is a lot of these big brokers that get contracts for big oil companies that cover huge areas in the basin, in a particular basin, like the Powder River Basin, for instance. And they all require these. So if you want to work, you sign it, because it's the only game in town. And if you sign it, you're stuck there. You're not free to go work for another company or anything else for 12 to 24, even sometimes 2 or 3 years after the fact. And the oil doesn't move, it's in the same spot. So if you're prohibited from working in a huge area, multiple townships, for instance, that takes away your ability to ever work again in this state. It's predatory. I think this is a good idea. I've thought about this bill for a long time for that particular reason. And a lot of the people, it's not just the landmen, it's the secretaries, all the way down to the division order analysts, everything like that. So, if there was a bigger market out there, it would, my good colleague from Casper's argument's exactly right. They're voluntary contracts. But when, in the real world though, from my experience, when it's the only game in town, if you want to work, you got to sign it, and then you're stuck. You can't go back there. I had this happen to me in Utah. I couldn't go back to a specific basin in Utah because of a non-compete for years, and I missed out on good work opportunities. So on and for the bill.
Senator Landon.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I learned a lot in the Wyoming Senate, that's for sure. This is a really compelling bill, and appreciated the words of the senator from up north. I'm just thinking out loud here with all of you, wondering if there's any dampening effect on the front end at all. If, for example, an institution or an industry in a given community cannot execute one of those contracts that was just described, is there any cooling effect? I don't think so, but I'm just wondering. I want to make sure that we're not closing doors on potential employment. If a hospital, for example, I don't mean to pick on hospitals, but let's just say a hospital says, well, if we can't execute the contract that we want, then we're just not going to hire anybody. And we'll just start chipping everybody down to that other state. I don't think that would be the ramification, but just kind of wondering out loud with you. Thank you.
Senator Kolb.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this, on and for the bill, but this bill's trying to strike a balance. I think, as we all know, one side of the equation has too much weight. It's lopsided. And it's been kind of lopsided in the state of Wyoming for a while. We've got situations where low-level people are under these contracts of non-compete. I mean, just, at the lower levels of, say, in nursing facilities. And our state is made up in such a way that there's vast distances between cities and opportunities to work. So literally, for whatever reason, if you depart that company you have a no-compete clause with, you're stuck going somewhere else, moving your whole family. In essence, losing your ability to make that level of wage because of your skill won't be able to be used close by where you lived. So this isn't something that just came up overnight. The good senator that brought this forward, this has been worked on. It's been refined, trying to strike a balance on a right-to-work state. This is by far the best bill I've seen that attempts to do this. I think it's needed. We live in, like I say, our state's unique. I mean, it's the least populated state in the United States, and it's caused a lot of problems with people with certain skill levels, be it welders or be it, people at whatever level besides the higher levels who can negotiate their own contracts. Doctors have attorneys, they negotiate their contracts with said medical facilities, which we have in my Senate district. But we're not really talking about those folks. We're talking about the vast number of folks that are forced to sign a contract because, they need to work probably, really more than anything. And sometimes, they aren't the most sophisticated people in the world. They're just hardworking people, want to go to work in the state of Wyoming. And this helps protect those people to continue to do what they do for their family and make a living. On and for the bill, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Golden. Further discussion? Question on the bill. All those in favor of Senator Olson's motion that when the committee of the whole rises to report it, do so with a favorable recommendation on Senate File 107, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Senate File 107 is passed committee of the whole. Next bill for consideration is, Senate Joint Resolution 7.
Senate Joint Resolution 7, NCSL 50th Anniversary, a joint resolution to recognize and commend the National Conference of State Legislatures on the 50th anniversary of its founding in 2025, sponsored by Senator Pappas, was referred to Committee Number 8, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Anderson, Brennan, Cooper, Colvin, Pappas. Senator Pappas, Chairman.
Senator Pappas, what is your pleasure?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report that it does so with a due pass recommendation on Senate Joint Resolution 0007, NCSL 50th Anniversary. Good senators, you've seen this language last year. This was identical resolution that you signed. But what you signed last year was a informal resolution of the Senate. Our good past president from Devil's Tower area ran this as a Senate resolution. So it didn't make it to the floor. Now, virtually every state in the union is passing a similar resolution to this. And so I think Wyoming needs to actually have the entire legislature pass a resolution honoring NCSL. And for the new members, NCSL is the National Conference of State Legislators. It's a body of legislators and staff that caters to the number one body in government, legislatures, and provides training and all sorts of information and services that help us do our job. And we, as Wyoming, as a Wyoming legislature, pay dues to this organization, and we're members of it. So it was founded in 1975. They're celebrating 50 years in 2025, and I would hope that you would agree that it is a worthwhile organization and that you would honor the organization by passing this resolution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Pappas. Any further discussion on the bill? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senator Pappas' motion when the committee of the whole rises to report it, do so with a favorable recommendation of Senate Joint Resolution number 7, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Joint Resolution number 7 is passed committee of the whole. The next bill for our consideration is Senate File 147.
Senate File 147, Service Dogs Training and Crimes, an act relating to the protection and rights of blind and disabled persons, sponsored by Senator Hutchings, was referred to Committee Number 10, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Barlow, Crum, Hutchings, and Scott. Excused, Senator Steinmetz. Senator Barlow, Chairman.
Senator Barlow, what is your pleasure?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the Committee of the Whole rises to report and do so with a due pass recommendation on Senate File 147, Service Dogs Training and Crimes. There are no standing committee amendments, and I turn the explanation of this good bill over to Senator Hutchings.
Let me find you here. Senator Hutchins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question, do you want the long version or the short version? Okay, we'll keep it short. This is such an amazing bill. The good chairman of Labor and Health brought this to me and asked me if I would like to run it. I have neighbors that train service dogs, so it was right up my alley. A young lady from Uintah County suggested that we do this. Very, very, very simple. The statutes haven't been updated, short version, since 1977. So what we're doing is, with Senate File 147, Service Dogs Training and Crimes, is specifying that the rights and obligations applicable to service dogs and assistance animals apply to service and assistant animals that are being trained. And we're increasing the penalties. So if you go over to page 2, where we're making the changes are on line 9. We're just adding it 9 through 13. We're adding in that a service dog in training has the same rights as a dog that's being trained. And it only makes sense if you're training a dog, he needs to be able to come and go and do the same things as a trained dog. Just want to make sure you know this does not include an emotional support dog, and I called it the little fluffy dogs that people like to carry around in little carriers. The emotional support dog has to mitigate one or more identified symptoms or effects of the person's disability. And then on page 3, up the penalties from on lines 7 through 10, 1 year, for if you harm willfully and knowingly a service dog under his owner's control and inflict serious bodily harm, you can spend less than 1 year in jail and a fine of no more than $5,000. And some people think it's excessive, but these people that have these animals, I don't know if you saw them come in yesterday to the Senate, these dogs are an extension of them. They spend $20,000, $25,000 to buy and train these dogs. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I ask for your favorable vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hutchins. Questions on the bill? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator Barlow's motion on the committee of the whole rises to report, it does so with a favorable recommendation of Senate File 147. Please say aye. Those opposed? Senate File 147 is passed the committee of the whole. Madam Majority Floor Leader, I seem to be out of bills again. I got one of those. You got it gone.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I move that the committee of the whole rise and report.
You've heard the motion. All those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? Motion carries.
Committee of the whole report.
Mr. President, Chair Committee of the Whole, having had under considerations bills on general file, begs leave to report as follows. Senate File 108, do pass. Senate File 121, do pass. Senate File 120, do pass. Senate File 97, do pass. Senate File 138, do pass amended. Senate File 82, do pass. Senate File 144, do pass. Senate File 116, do pass amended. Senate File 113, do pass. Senate File 110, do pass. Senate File 135, do pass amended. Senate File 64, do pass amended. Senate File 88, do pass amended. Senate File 130, do pass amended. Senate File 131, do pass amended. Senate File 146, do pass amended. Senate File 112, do pass amended. Senate File 119, do pass amended. Senate File 107, do pass. Senate Joint Resolution 7, do pass. Senate File 147, do pass. Senator Cooper, Chairman.
You've heard the report. What is your pleasure? Senator Cooper.
Mr. President, I move the adoption of committee of the whole report.
You've heard the motion. All in favor, say aye. All opposed, no. Committee of the whole report has been adopted. Good job, Senator Cooper. All right. Introduction of Senate File 0001, the budget bill. First reading of the bill.
Senate File 1, General Government Appropriations, sponsored by the Joint Appropriations Committee.
Thank you. Pursuant to Joint Rule 14-1B, Senate File 1 is referred directly to Committee of the Whole. Reports from Standing Committee.
Mr. President, the following reports are dated January 30, 2025. Committee number 1, Judiciary, to whom was referred Senate File 101, Post-Conviction DNA Testing Procedure Amendments. Respectfully, the report same back to the Senate with a recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Crago, Hicks, Kolb, and Olson. Excuse, Senator Crum. Senator Olson, Chairman. Committee number 1, Judiciary, to whom was referred Senate File 114, Missing Persons Reporting Requirement. Respectfully report same back to the Senate with a recommendation that it do pass amended. Ayes, Senators Crago, Hicks, Kolb, and Olson. Excuse, Senator Crum. Senator Olson, Chairman.
Thank you. Any messages from the House? None? All right. Madam Majority Floor Leader, that clears the desk. Oh, I'm daydreaming.
Mr. President, I move that we stand adjourned until 10 a.m. Friday, January 31st, 2025.
All right. Any announcements? Senator Landon.
Mr. President, thank you. Just real quickly to get way out in front of this to help fellow senators, your Travel, Recreation, Wildlife, and Cultural Resources Committee will meet 8 o'clock next Tuesday to take up an important bill, Senate File 132, Protecting Critical Infrastructure and Systems from Drones. We will also take up Senate File 164, Parimutuel Rodeo Definitions, and Senate File 170, Grizzly Bear Management Prohibition next Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your committee number 1, Judiciary, will meet tomorrow upon noon recess in W002 to continue from today, Senate File 117, Shared Parenting.
Thank you. Senator Schuler.
Thank you, Mr. President. Education Committee number 4 will meet tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock a.m. in W10 and online. We're going to add one more bill to our list. Senate File 137, School Finance Cash Reserves. Senate File 162, Education Block Grant Model Amendments. Senate File 123, School Finance Competitive Grants for Crossing Guards. And we think we can maybe get to Senate Joint Resolution 6, School Capital Construction Constitutional Amendment. See if we can get through 4 of them. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Senator Anderson.
Mr. President, your favorite committee, Senate Minerals, Business, and Economic Development, will meet Friday, January 31st upon noon recess at the Capitol Extension Room W4. We'll hear 3 bills, Senate File 186, Advanced Nuclear Reactor Manufacturers Fuel Storage, Senate File 92, Make Carbon Dioxide Great Again, Net Zero, Senate File 134, Industrial Siting Wildlife Mitigation. We will be flexible because there's a speaker we want to hear on Senate File 134 that may have to move back and forth, so we'll be a little bit flexible on our order of those bills. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your committee number 3, Senate Revenue, will meet upon noon recess tomorrow to take up Senate File 151, Monthly Ad Valorem Tax Distribution Amendments, Senate File 185, Governmental Property Taxation and Sale, and Senate File 163, Partial Tobacco Products Tax Repeal. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other announcements? Seeing none, you've all heard the majority leader's motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Senate will stand adjourned until 10 a.m. Friday, January 31st.